The first presentation, I'd like to call up Mark Faries. Mark has presented here at the OCAMPR Conference before. His talk today is on gut madness, on the passion of gluttony and health. So I'm going to take very close notes. Mark is a professor and extension specialist in behavioral medicine with Texas A&M Health Extension and adjunct faculty with the Texas A&M School of Medicine and School of Public Health. His work explores why and how people initiate and maintain healthy behaviors with focus on psychological, behavioral, and ancient Christian perspectives. He's going to present his paper here this morning and also give you an opportunity to ask him questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Your Grace. Clergy, brothers and sisters, thanks for coming to maybe the most awkward topic to discuss, and perhaps a bit sensitive. Understand that, maybe some pain hidden there as well. But I'm going to let St. Gregory of Nyssa rip off the Band-Aid if I can. Who is the stranger to the brutish pleasure of gluttony? And the pleasure of taste is, one may well say, the mother of each individual evil. For who does not know that indulgence of the palate is pretty nearly the root of all sins committed in the physical life? For on this depend luxury and drunkenness, gluttony and prodigality of table, filling oneself up to satiety and reveling until one sinks into the depths of shameful passions like irrational brutes. That's just the warm-up. Gluttony is no stranger to us either. Finding a comfortable home in contemporary society, inspired by insatiable appetites, accessible and tempting environments, and the norm and common pleasures of the life, even to the point, according to Dr. Larcher, of being stripped of guilt and perversely set up as a virtue. Our modern word for gluttony comes from the Latin, roughly meaning to swallow or gulp down in an overindulgent, excessive manner. This means that a glut or the glutton expresses a deeper sort of internal desire to consume in excess, most commonly of food, overeating, or alcohol and drunkenness, as we see in the scriptures. Gluttony is not simply another carnal passion, but declared first among the 8 principal faults. 8, correct? The prince of the passions, a strong and brutal passion that fetters the heart and destroys everything good. It is often expressed with, if often expressed with the belly, the seat of the passions, and in turn with the desirous power of the soul, epithemia. St. Nilos the ascetic says that the belly is, quote, a very apt symbol for the life of pleasure, since the belly is the cause of virtually all pleasures, unquote. And then, forgive me, Your Grace, but St. John Climacus writes in the Ladder of Divine Ascent, I think we can glean this wisdom here. It says, quote, gluttony is hypocrisy of the stomach. Filled, it moans about scarcity. Stuffed and crammed, it wails about its hunger. For the truth is, as one will discover, that the belly is the cause of all human shipwreck, unquote. Dmitri Staniloy points out that the stomach, by gluttony, becomes a sea impossible to fill, a good description of any passion. The infinite thirst of the passions, rather than being filled with the infinite, relentlessly seek to be filled with the finite objects of the world, which can never satisfy them. Thus, gluttony is often referred to as gastromorrhagia, literally gut madness. St. John Chrysostom reminds Christians, quote, you have received a belly that you may feed, not distend it, that you may have the mastery over it, not have it as a mistress over you, that it may minister to you for the nourishment of the other parts, not that you may minister to it, not that you may exceed limits, unquote. Perhaps, again, this is still a fitting description for us and our bellies today. Of the many who are struggling against gluttony, or maybe who have surrendered to it. So to help, by God's grace, I would like to share what I've been learning over the last several years studying this. In my field of behavioral medicine, I particularly study why people change, why people don't change, particularly in chronic disease prevention. The whole idea of just do it and people will respond is not my world. So we all can know what to do, but then struggle to make that happen. And so I'm going to go and present this in 4 sort of sections, but really 3 primary sections. Being a passion, gluttony moves us, 1, beyond need. Secondly, we'll see it moves us beyond health. And third, we'll see that it moves us beyond control. Beyond need. So as a sinful passion is clearly moving us beyond what we need, both in quantity and quality of food eaten. Since humans cannot subsist without tasting food, according to St. Jerome, quote, it follows that reason must be present, that we may take food of such a kind, quality, and in such quantities as will not burden the body or hinder the free movement of the soul, unquote. So for quantity, take a moment in your mind to answer the following question. Have you overeaten at any point in the past week? If you answered yes, then you're not alone. Research clearly reveals that a majority, actually, even of self-professed Christians, confess that they had overeaten in the past week. And Americans overeat beyond health recommendations on average. Ancient Christians did not have our modern calculators to help assess daily energy needs, calories, or maybe our serving sizes. But there is ample teaching on paying attention and then individual prescriptions to how and how much one eats. For example, St. John Cassian notes 3 types of gluttony. 1, that which drives a monk to eat before the proper and stated times. 2, that which cares about filling the belly and gorging it with all kinds of food. And 3, that which is on the lookout for dainties and delicacies. For while the, quote, righteous has enough to satisfy his appetite, states Proverbs 13:25, the belly of the wicked suffers want. Thus, according to St. Basil the Great, the objective that we must be common to all Christians is satisfying need. Since, quote, filling the stomach to satiety, burdening it with food, is an act deserving of malediction. Such excess renders the body unfit for work, prone to sleep, and more susceptible to harm. Nor, to be sure, ought pleasure to be made the end in taking food, but the aim should be sustaining of life for those who have renounced intemperate delights. So we might self-diagnose eating beyond need as what, being full, having to unbutton your pants after a meal, or saying maybe my eyes were bigger than my stomach after loading up your buffet plate, which is something we can all look out for this weekend. However, our feelings of being full can be deceptive. And actually, the consensus of the church fathers that I have discovered is that if we have eaten until we are full, we have likely overeaten. For example, the stomach has receptors that sense stretch and communicate back to our brains to regulate food intake, telling us when we are getting full. The more we overeat, the receptors can undergo a drastic shift. So for example, in adults with obesity, the receptors that normally tell them to reduce food intake as the stomach fills can actually promote food intake, just the opposite, telling them to eat more. Also with diets that are high in fat, such as in our common unhealthy diets, the standard American diet or SAD diet appropriately, the receptors that sense stomach stretch can be dampened and not as sensitive to the stretching, so our brains don't get the normal signals of fullness, and we more easily lead to overeating beyond need, which also points us to the quality of food. From a health perspective, barring any specific medical contraindications, we need sensible combinations of whole, nutrient-dense foods like fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, and other plants that are packed with nutrition, while more closely imitating the diet of paradise in Genesis 1:29, as St. Basil the Great encourages. Quote, however, now indeed as we wish to conduct ourselves in imitation of the life of paradise, we avoid this excessively material enjoyment of food, conducting ourselves as far as possible according to that life, using fruits and grains and the produce of fruit trees for passing through life. But what surpasses these things we reject as unnecessary, unquote. So let us ask ourselves often, do I need this, whatever this might be? It can help remind us of the importance of eating from need, both in quantity and the quality of our food. rather than want, which only adds fuel to the passionate fire of the belly. Next, the passion of gluttony moves us beyond health. When defining gluttony, Larcher notes in seeking out different kinds of food, whether that be quantitatively or qualitatively, it is, quote, not without the aim of getting something to eat and maintaining one's health, but simply on account of the pleasure that they are able to give, a veritable perversion of the nutritive function. Or as St. Mark the Monk notes, my patron saint, quote, he who enjoys bodily pleasures beyond the proper limit will pay for the excess 100-fold in sufferings, unquote. I found that these sufferings span both physical and spiritual health. Of course, there is much attention to the role of overeating, of unhealthy diets in modern medicine. My area, an unhealthy diet has surpassed tobacco smoking as the leading risk factor for premature death in the U.S. and counts for 1 out of 5 deaths globally. Nearly 80% of all chronic disease, which is our most deadly and most costly of all diseases, being preventable and in some cases reversible through a lifestyle that's led by a moderate, healthy diet, particularly one that mirrors that of paradise. The link of gluttony to poor health is nothing new to the ancient perspective, which would think it madness to eat in a manner not to maintain or improve health, but to knowingly undermine it, all to satisfy carnal pleasure. From the Jewish wisdom of the book of Sirach, quote, do not be gluttonous for every dainty food, and do not give yourself over to food, for overeating will bring sickness and gluttony will lead to nausea. Many have died because of gluttony, but the careful man will prolong his life, unquote. So in the early centuries of the church, we are taught on what we know far too well in the 21st century, yet often ignored, that gorging gives rise to disease, says St. Jerome. And diseases of the body, says St. John Chrysostom, quote, are the natural offspring not of abstinence and moderate diet, but of gluttony and repletion. And how gluttony will sweep away all the bulwarks of our health. And if you enter a physician's house and ask him, you will find that almost all causes of diseases arise from this, unquote. Yet Chrysostom also notes that while we do not avoid bread or wine or even dainties as unclean in themselves, their excess is forbidden, quote, as they corrupt the soul by excess. The passions, especially gluttony, are a result of a sick soul, rendering the soul diseased, and its first victim being the nous, the purest eye of the soul which perceives the perfection of the godly life. So to summarize the patristic teaching for time's sake, gluttony drives out self-control, moderation, and all the virtues, kindles the baneful and fiery incentive to vice, coarsening the nous, making it spiritless and sluggish or cloddish and brute-like, and never lets it raise itself toward God in the practice of the virtues. Thus, says St. Maximus the Confessor, it, quote, kills all the divine offspring of the virtues, unquote. From gluttony comes no spiritual vision. In other words, St. Simeon the New Theologian concludes that, quote, we cannot both sate ourselves with food and spiritually enjoy divine and numinal blessings. The more we pander to the stomach, the less we can experience such spiritual enjoyment, unquote. For when the belly is inflamed by luxurious foods, warns St. Nilos the Ascetic, the mind loses all power to conceive what is good and is paralyzed in its spiritual efforts. But one who is beginning to pursue the spiritual way gets rid of the fat around his belly by giving up rich food. That's St. Nilos, not me. And thus, as St. Seraphim of Sarov teaches, quote, one should not think about doing the doings of God when one's stomach is full. On a full stomach, there can be no vision of the divine mysteries, unquote. So with no spiritual vision comes darkness. From Proverbs, it says, feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? In turn, it is those who choose gluttony over God that St. Paul calls lazy gluttons. If you translate that, slow or idle bellies, Titus 1, who profess to know God but deny him by their works, being detestable, disobedient, and unfit for any good work, in an idolatrous state where their God is their belly, Philippians 3. And so finally, The passion of gluttony moves us beyond control. In the medical literature, we find two relevant concerns: binge eating and food addiction. In the 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria contrasts gastrimargia, an excess with respect to food, insanity in reference to the belly, as we've learned, with leimargia. This is insanity with respect to the gullet, the neck, and the throat. It has been suggested that gastrimargia most closely conveys our modern concept of binge eating behavior or disorder, overeating when one is satiated, and accompanied by a feeling of a lack of control, while the term leimargia conveys food addiction, an excessive craving for food. A recent review found that food addiction has been diagnosed in almost 1 out of 4 people, but increasing to 1 out of 2 in those with binge eating symptoms or disorder. The concern for our purposes here is that a person who is addicted to food exhibits loss of control, tolerance, withdrawal, and continued use despite the dangerous consequences. From the ancient Christian perspective, the deeper concern is beyond the loss of control to enslavement to the passions. St. Jerome highlights, quote, "The smells of the kitchen may induce us to eat, but when hunger is satisfied, they make us their slaves," unquote. And speaking of the passions again, Father Staniloy summarizes, quote, "The passions represent the lowest level to which human nature can fall. The man is brought by them to a state of passivity, of slavery. In fact, they overcome the will, so that the man of the passion is no longer a man of will. We say that he is a man ruled, enslaved, carried along by the passions," unquote. So consider an unhealthy food that you enjoy to eat often, okay, but you know you should cut back. So an unhealthy food, eat too much of, you know you should cut back, maybe the doctor's told you to. You got it? Just one. Give it up forever right now. Would that be tough? Could you limit it to at least healthful moderation? It'd be tough. If not, then who is in control? What is in control? Are we truly in control if we cannot limit to at least a moderation? Deceptively, lack of control of unhealthy gluttonous desire will disguise itself as choice or liberty. I talked about this last year. Through a few simple principles, St. Paul takes the presumed liberty of the Christians in Corinth, of which you're probably very familiar. "All things are lawful for me," they said, "but not all things are helpful. But all things are lawful, yeah, but not everything builds up, edifies. All things are lawful for me," they said. St. Paul says, "Yeah, but I will not be enslaved by anything." 1 Corinthians 6 and 10. St. John Chrysostom comments here. Here, Paul glances at the gluttons. This is his meaning. "You are at liberty to eat," says he. "Well then, remain in liberty. And take heed that you do not become a slave to this appetite. For it is a strong and brutal passion, and makes us slaves, and puts us upon ministering to the belly," unquote. So we're going to try to end on a positive note. So while there are those who have surrendered to gluttony, there are others waging an intense war for freedom. I hope that's all of us. Of his own fight, Chrysostom shares, quote, "Stubborn as appetite is, and the tyranny of the belly, nevertheless I bridle it, and give not myself up to the passion, but endure all labor not to be drawn aside by it," unquote. Up against the passions of the flesh, we can have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out, as we learn in Romans 7. Yet we also learn that, quote, "It is for freedom Christ has set us free. So we can stand firm and not submit again to the yoke of bondage," Galatians 5:1. Or as is sung in the Lenten Triodian, quote, "Through thy passion-loving Lord, thou hast given to all men freedom from passions, putting to death the passions of my flesh by thy cross," unquote. In baptism, the flesh, the dead, hardened, unfeeling, and festering part of the soul that seeks carnal passions and indulgence is cut away. quote, putting off the works of the flesh and a cleansing of the soul from the filth that has grown on it from the carnal mind. For the Christian, then, any enslavement to gluttony or the passions would be one of volition. As St. Basil asks, quote, O human, you are a ruling being, and why do you serve the passions as a slave? Unquote. Christians are prescribed a number of beautiful mystical medicines for the healing of gluttony, such as keeping the commandments, abiding in Christ through the Eucharist, focusing on the quality and simplicity of one's diet, avoiding greediness and dainty preparation of food, of course fasting, and then making no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires, Romans 13:14. Of which a question I like to help diagnose this is, I ask patients and clients and students a lot, how easy is it for you to eat unhealthily in your house? And they're like, that's pretty easy. Well, perhaps you have the self-control for that, but if you don't, then perhaps we're making provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. So environment plays a big role there. We also know that it is where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, so that we can be transformed into the image of Christ, 2 Corinthians 3. Thus, there is one remedy I want to end with that is most often highlighted from what I've found, standing in formidable direct opposition to gluttony. This virtue, egratia in Greek, often translated as continence or self-control, is perhaps better seen as self-mastery or dominion within, maintaining control rather than handing it over to the fleshly desires. St. John Cassian shares that there is one aim and object of continence, that, quote, no one may be overburdened by the measure of his appetite by gluttony, unquote. Others note that not only does the person who practices continence avoid gluttony, but gluttony is destroyed by continence. We recently sung a hymn last Saturday at Vespers for a magnificent 3rd century saint, Saint Coriton, the Confessor, which said, quote, thou didst wither up the passions of the body by continence, unquote. So where might we find this passion or this virtue? St. Basil points us in the right direction. Concupiscence, the strong fleshly desire, is a disease of the soul, whereas its health is continence. Not to be drunken is continency. Not to overeat oneself is continency. Continency makes one free, being at once a medicine and a power, for it does not teach temperance, it gives it. And here's the kicker. Continency is a grace of God, unquote. So continency comes in our co-participation and synergy with God through virtue in the likeness of Christ. St. Paul instructs that if you walk by the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Galatians 5:16. And knowing that the fruit of the Spirit are what? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and continence, ingratia. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Galatians 5. So I'm going to let St. John Chrysostom conclude for us. Quote, therefore, he says, walk by the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. Having spoken of the cause of the disease, he likewise mentions the remedy which confers health. Unquote. Thank you.